all the gospel accounts and Acts too, there's a lot of geography that goes on, and not that this is not a geography lesson or anything, but it kind of helps to have an idea of how the land is laid out. Jesus does a lot around the Sea of Galilee. The Sea of Galilee is that little sea in the middle of the land there, and there's a river, the River Jordan. I don't think it's actually labeled on that map, but the River Jordan flows from the Sea of Galilee all the way down to the Dead Sea. All these towns and cities are named in the gospel accounts, and it's really nice to be able to look at those. I couldn't get one that was detailed enough and printer friendly, but this will at least give you a little bit of a visual. So we're continuing in the Gospel of Mark. We're going to finish up chapter 7 today, and we're actually going to start into chapter 8. So last week, we finished looking at the Pharisees and the traditions that they had prioritized over the commandments of God. According to Jesus, they had set aside the commandments of God to follow the traditions of men. And Jesus would also go on to say, there in Mark chapter 7, that it's not what you eat that makes you unclean. It's not these traditions of washing your hands every time you might have come in contact with a Gentile or something like that. That's not what makes you clean or unclean. It's what comes out of us. It's what comes out of our hearts is what makes us clean or unclean, which would have flown in the face of a lot of their most sacred Jewish traditions at the time, their cultural and dietary and ceremonial and religious traditions. Today, Jesus heads northwest this week. So there's a group of scribes and Pharisees that have come from Jerusalem. Jerusalem is down south below Samaria. He's been doing his work around Capernaum. He's been sort of based in Capernaum and working all around it. You've got Nazareth and everything. So they've come up from Jerusalem to Galilee. And so after this debate that he's had with the scribes and Pharisees, it says that Jesus is going to leave there, and he is going to go to the region of Tyre, Tyre. So he's headed northwest out of Galilee up here to Tyre, all the way up on the coast, the northwest coast of the Mediterranean Sea. Tyre is primarily Gentile country, again. And nothing in the Gospels, well, nothing in any of the Bible, is ever just unintentional or just window dressing. It's always arranged on purpose. And so we have Jesus going to Tyre, a primarily Gentile city, vast majority Gentile, immediately after having this conversation about what makes a person clean or unclean, what makes them part of God's people. So this first story that we're going to read today, Mark 7:24 through 8, verse 9. And this first story is why we don't just read one or two verses without context. There's a saying, I didn't come up with it, but it's a good saying, that's, you never just read a verse. And the American church in particular, we've gotten really good at just reading a verse. You just take one verse and you build a whole theology out of one verse instead of looking at the context, instead of reading what's around it, what's in the story. In this story, this first one about the Syro-Phoenician woman, or in Matthew, she's referred to as a Canaanite woman. Jesus is going to say something that comes across as very shocking and could even be taken as derogatory or him like talking down to her. But you've got to look at the context of what he says. You got to look at the broader context that the gospel story tells us. Jesus does not call a woman a dog. That's what I'm getting at. Okay, that's just to preface it. Jesus does not call a woman a dog and talk down to her like a dog. That's why we don't just read a verse, though. If you isolate what Jesus says to this woman, as many have done throughout the years, there's a lot of atheist arguments or even just cynical people that, are trying to bring in some sort of undermining agenda toward Jesus to be like, oh, he's not really fully God, fully man. See, he was all the ists. He was sexist and racist in this moment and all that. They would take that verse by itself and say, see how he talked to this Canaanite woman? So he couldn't be God. He's actually just... And so, again, that's why we're not going to approach it that way, because that's not what actually happens in the story. And when we do that, what does that do for our picture of God? If we believe Jesus to be fully God and fully man, which we do, what does it do for our picture of God that God looks at a Canaanite woman and calls her a dog? Again, that's why we don't want to do that. So Tyre and Sidon, those towns come up a lot in the prophets. Tyre and Sidon are these pretty famous cities. They're a hub of trade. Back in those days, you had a lot of trade across the Mediterranean Sea. They would trade spices and anything that was non-perishable, anything that could survive transport over a long distance. They would trade them. And yes, those harbors, there are tons of harbors in those cities, and they were about as Gentile as it gets. Just a quick refresher on the Gospel of Mark so far. What have Jesus' encounters with the Gentiles looked like so far in Mark? Back in Mark chapter 3, which is, feels like an eternity ago, but back in Mark chapter 3, there were people coming to see Jesus from all over the place. And it says, and they were coming from Jerusalem. This is Mark 3:8. And Idumea, and beyond the Jordan, and the vicinity of Tyre and Sidon. A great number of people heard of all that Jesus was doing and came to him. So these people in Tyre and Sidon have heard of him, and they were coming to him in Galilee, seeking healing, seeking demons to be cast out, and approaching him. We also have in chapter 5, verses 1 through 20, Jesus heals the man that has the legion of demons and casts them into the pigs. That's in the country of the Gerasenes. That is Gentile country. And so those Gentiles begged Jesus to leave their region. And the man who had the demons begged Jesus to take him along with him. But then Jesus told that man that he had healed, that he had cast the demons out of, told him to go and tell everyone. And that's going to be important for this story today too. Jesus told that man to go tell everyone what great things the Lord had done for him. That was in the area of the Decapolis, is where that happened. That's down here. That's on the southeast side of the Sea of Galilee. It's Gentile country. That's where Jesus cast the legion of demons into the herd of swine, the herd of pigs. And Jesus told him, go tell everybody. He's been telling all the Jews up to that point, don't tell anybody. And even after that, he tells Jairus, after he raises Jairus' daughter from the dead, he says, don't tell anybody. But he told that Gentile man, tell everybody what great things the Lord has done for him, and how he had mercy on him. And the man went and started telling everyone in the Decapolis all the great things that Jesus had done for him. So, we're going to read these stories together. There's 3 things that happen here, and then we'll dive into them a little bit. Chapter 7, verse 24. Jesus got up and went away from there to the region of Tyre. And when he had entered a house, he wanted no one to know of it, yet he could not escape notice. But after hearing of Jesus, a woman whose little daughter had an unclean spirit immediately came and fell at his feet. Now the woman was a Gentile of the Syrophoenician race, and she kept asking Jesus to cast the demon out of her daughter. And Jesus was saying to her, let the children be satisfied first, for it is not good to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs. But she answered and said to him, yes, Lord, but even the dogs under the table feed on the children's crumbs. And Jesus said to her, because of this answer, go, the demon has gone out of your daughter. And going back to her home, she found the child lying on the bed, and the demon having left. Again, Jesus went out from the region of Tyre and came through Sidon, further north. So, look at your map there. Sidon is all the way up here. So, he goes from Tyre up to through Sidon to the region of the Decapolis. So he's going basically touring around through all this Gentile country is what happens. He's making a slow loop around the Sea of Galilee all the way around to the Decapolis. So taking the scenic route through Gentile country. So again, he went out from the region of Tyre and came through Sidon to the Sea of Galilee within the region of the Decapolis. So he's looping around. They brought to Jesus one who was deaf and spoke with difficulty, and they implored him to lay his hands on him. Jesus took him aside from the crowd by himself and put his fingers into his ears, and after spitting, he touched his tongue with the saliva. Really weird. And looking up to heaven with a deep sigh, Jesus said to him, Ephphatha, we're going to go with Ephphatha, that is, be opened. And his ears were opened, and the impediment of his tongue was removed, and he began speaking plainly. And he gave them orders not to tell anyone, but the more he ordered them, the more widely they continued to proclaim it. Okay, now Jesus is in Gentile country, where he has formerly said, go tell everyone. Now he's telling Gentiles too. Don't tell anybody. But of course it's not working. It's too amazing. It's too wonderful. But there in verse 36, and he gave them orders not to tell anyone. But the more he ordered them, the more widely they continued to proclaim it. They were utterly astonished, saying, he has done all things well. He makes even the deaf to hear and the mute to speak. Chapter 8. In those days, when there was again a large crowd, and they had nothing to eat, Jesus called his disciples and said to them, now remember, we're still in Gentile country. We've not left the Decapolis. Mark always tells us where we're at. We've not left the Decapolis. Still in Gentile country. Jesus called his disciples and said to them, I feel compassion for the people, because they have remained with me now 3 days and have nothing to eat. Have we heard a story like this recently? And he said, if I send them away hungry to their homes, they will faint on the way. And some of them have come from a great distance. And his disciples answered him, where will anyone be able to find enough bread here in this desolate place to satisfy these people? They still don't get it. However, I think there's more to that response too, and we'll get into that in a minute. His disciples have already seen him feed 5,000 plus people. But they ask him, where will anyone be able to find enough bread here in this desolate place to satisfy these people? And he was asking them, how many loaves do you have? And they said 7. And he directed the people to sit down on the ground, and taking the 7 loaves, he gave thanks and broke them, and started giving them to his disciples to serve to them, and they served them to the people. They also had a few small fish, and after he had blessed them, he ordered these to be served as well. And they ate and were satisfied. And they picked up 7 large baskets full of what was left over of the broken pieces, and about 4,000 were there, and he sent them away. We'll stop there, but he goes back over then to the Israelite side, to the Jewish side of the Sea of Galilee after that. We have these stories, these 3 stories, all dealing with Gentiles. You have a deaf and mute man who's a Gentile, obviously this Syro-Phoenician woman, or this Canaanite woman, as Matthew puts it. And then you have 4,000 Gentiles out in the wilderness. What's going on here? Why do we have this story just after Jesus talking about what makes a person clean or unclean? What makes a person able to be right before God? Why is Jesus going up here in the first place? Back in verse 24 of chapter 7, why is Jesus going up there in the first place? He's trying to rest and get away for a minute. Jesus, we've already been hearing about how he's exhausted, and he's not getting any rest. He's being constantly hounded by the crowds, and because he's Jesus, he continues to have patience and compassion for the crowds, but he's exhausted. And it says he wanted nobody to know about it. It says when he had entered a house, he wanted no one to know of it, yet he could not escape notice. He's trying to get up there and get away from it a little bit and rest. He's just trying to rest. He thinks perhaps, if he goes 60 miles, maybe he'll be able to get away from the crowds a little bit, but it's already caught up to him. It's a true testament to the power of word of mouth, but it's also a true testament to the popularity of Jesus as well. On foot, 60 miles. I had a note here. That's like going to, either Lebanon or Crossville from, along I-40 from Gainesboro. Now, I cannot imagine going to Lebanon or Crossville and not being able to eat a meal or walk along the street without a mob of people surrounding me, wanting my attention and I cannot imagine that. Nobody would notice me. If I walked down the streets of Lebanon right now, I would be invisible. Jesus is so popular that he can't even like sneak into a house to just sleep and rest and pray. He's that popular. That's the following that Jesus has. That's the magnitude of the following that has been generated by his ministry. And what's more, Tyre, as we've already said, is a Gentile city. It's primarily a Gentile city. Jesus' popularity has grown that even in the Gentile cities, he can't escape notice. That's how Mark says. He could not escape notice. So there would have been some Jews, but not many. And these stories are meant to be contrasted with the story that we discussed over the last couple of weeks, as we said, where Jesus is debating about clean and unclean. The Jews, the ceremonial washing that they're talking about, washing your hands before meals. We're not going to go all the way back through that, but we're not talking about just like rinse your hands for good hygiene. You're talking about ceremonial, like it's a to do a ceremonial washing when you return from the marketplace, as Mark puts it, just in case you've come in contact with any Gentile. That's what is going on in the ceremonial washing happening there in the early part of Mark chapter 7. And just in case you came in contact with a Gentile, go through this whole to-do before you eat a meal, because otherwise you might become unclean. But meanwhile, Jesus leaves that debate and heads to Tyre, a Gentile city, to be surrounded by a Gentile mob, to spend the night or spend some days or whatever in a Gentile house. And we should also bear in mind, Mark's primary audience is Gentiles. Frequently you'll hear Mark called as, it's the Gentile gospel, the gospel written to the Gentiles. And it is primarily to early Gentile converts to Christianity. And so for them reading this is, you read Galatians and things like that, early Gentile converts to Christianity would be saying, regardless of what the Judaizers of Galatia are telling me about what I have to do to follow Jesus, Mark's telling me, actually, Jesus would be happy to sit at my table, would be happy to come into my house, would be happy to be in my town. So in verses 25 and 26, after hearing of Jesus, there's a woman whose little daughter has an unclean spirit. And she immediately comes and falls at his feet, falls at the feet of Jesus, and begs him to cast the demon out of her daughter. Now, that pattern, we've seen that, but again, this is someone who comes and falls at the feet of Jesus. Mark has told us about, I think she's the 6th or 7th person at this point who has come and fallen at the feet of Jesus in Mark's gospel account. And so she falls at his feet, keeping up this pattern of recognizing his power, recognizing his authority, and what he's able to do. And she too falls at his feet. Also, this is another daughter. This is the third daughter in Mark's gospel account. You have Jairus' daughter, and then you have the woman with the issue of blood who Jesus calls daughter. He says, "Daughter, your faith has made you whole." And now you have a third daughter that is coming into contact with Jesus and his power. So that's just an interesting tidbit there. In verses 27 to 29, this is where the controversy arises a lot of times with what Jesus says. Jesus was saying to her, "Let the children be satisfied first, for it is not good to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs." Now, again, it's not Jesus calling this woman a dog. But we should ask, why is Jesus in Tyre? As we said, he's taking a break, trying to take a break. And this woman knows that Jesus is the Jewish prophet from Galilee. Mark invites us to ask. He's inviting the reader to ask, in light of all the healings, the exorcisms, the miracles, and the controversies, what is Jesus doing here in Tyre, but what's he doing in the world during this point in the gospel account? Why is he really here? And you're going to have the transfiguration in the latter part of Mark 8. So Mark is building everything up. He's ramping everything up to the revelation of Jesus is the Messiah. But what is Jesus here for anyway? Why has he come? What is his mission? Not just in Tyre, where he's at, but in the world at large, in Galilee. In Matthew's account, Jesus says, in response to this woman, in Matthew chapter 15, part of Jesus' response to her is, "I've been sent to the lost sheep of Israel." It's a really important takeaway in light of what he says about dogs and children and all this, he says, I've been sent to the lost sheep of Israel in the context of this story. Jesus didn't come just as a universal problem solver, walking around and distributing healing and exorcisms just for their own sake. That's not why he came. We know that he came ultimately to seek and save that which was lost and to bring salvation for the whole world, like we talked about this morning with you kids, with the Palm Sunday story. That's ultimately why Jesus came. But on a more zoomed in level, Jesus came for the lost sheep of Israel first, so that his message would then be proclaimed to the whole world from Jerusalem, and it would distribute out to the entire world. So again, Jesus, his primary mission is to Israel, to Israelites in context. He does heal, but he's not only there to be a healer. Miraculous healings and miracles were not the point of Jesus' ministry. They were, because he had the power of God and the power of new creation, they were springing out at all times. It was part of who he is that he brings healing, he brings wholeness. But to make the miracles the point, to make the miracles the main thing, we would actually miss the point. It would be a mistake to overemphasize them at the expense of what Jesus' mission is to Israel and to the children of Israel. So, verse 27, it has to be read in the context of the prior story. Jesus was talking about in the last section, clean versus unclean. It's not what goes into you that makes you unclean, but what comes out of your heart. All foods are clean, Mark says. Mark says that Jesus declares that through what he says in chapter 7, verse 19 there, that God is able to make all people clean. Not just foods, but that God is also able to make all people clean. So this is not about Jesus dissing the woman. What's going on here is not Jesus saying, I don't care about Gentiles. He's already healed Gentiles in Mark's gospel account. And Matthew also includes this story in Matthew chapter 15. Both Matthew and Mark thought this story was important to include. And they both put it directly after this debate about clean versus unclean. He's already cast demons out of a Gentile man. He's already interacted with Gentiles. So he has this back and forth with the woman. I think we would be interpreting it wrong if we hear Jesus saying these things in a derogatory or mean-spirited way. His words here are primarily about timing and attempting to get some rest. In Matthew's account, Jesus says, I've been sent, as we said there earlier, I've been sent to the lost sheep of Israel. Mark doesn't give us even that much detail. He makes us work for it like he always does. Mark will make you work for it every time. And that's just, he wants you to dig in. Matthew does too, but Matthew gives you more. Matthew gives you a loaf of bread and says, here, let's go on a journey. Mark is breadcrumbs one at a time. He's like, follow these breadcrumbs. I'm going to tell you about Jesus. So, the lost sheep, I've come to the lost sheep of Israel, been sent to the lost sheep of Israel. Verse 28 there, Jesus is the Jewish Messiah, come to preach to the Jewish lost sheep. That was his primary mission. And I'm just trying to make sure we hammer this home, but his primary mission in the context of the Gospels is to bring the good news to the Jews. And as he says in the Great Commission, like you'll start in Jerusalem and Samaria and the nation, it spreads. It's supposed to spread, but he brings it to the Jewish context first. But the woman could see, just as Jesus could, that the gospel of the kingdom was spilling over. The gospel of the kingdom is so rich and bountiful and explosive, I would even say. Have you ever been to a crawfish boil? Probably not. If you've ever been to, there's this thing that they do in Louisiana called a crawfish boil. Well, they'll bring out crawfish and potatoes and onions and carrots, all this stuff. They make all this in a big cauldron, and then they lay out newspapers on a table, and they dump all that out on the table. And, you pick up a crawfish here and a potato here, and you're just eating everything. And, I'm willing to bet that the dogs eat really well after a meal like that. Because it's the gospel is not just like a loaf of bread sitting on the middle of a table and there's the gospel, there's the good news of Jesus. No, it's spilling over. It's spilling off the table. There's so much of it that it can't just be contained in, a neat, tidy little package. And if our gospel can be contained in the middle of the table and never a crumb falls off, it's probably an incomplete gospel if it's not spilling out and spilling over, and if other people aren't noticing it and saying, I want some of that. If people aren't interested and wanting some of that. But this woman sees it. In the context of the story, this woman sees it. She sees that the bread of the kingdom is good. She sees that the gospel is good, and she wants some of it. She wants to know Jesus. The woman could see, just as Jesus could, that the gospel of the kingdom was spilling over. The gospel of Jesus Christ is too big to be contained by just one tribe or tongue or nation. And Jesus knows this. Jesus knows this. That's why he's going up to Tyre. That's why he's healing this woman's daughter. That's why he's going to heal a blind man. That's why he's about to feed 4,000 Gentiles. It's not exclusive. He's not saying, no, this is only for the Jews. That is his primary mission, but the gospel is too big to be contained. The time is coming when the dogs will be welcomed as children. The dogs will be welcomed in as children to sit at the table and to be part of the family just like everybody else. They will be children as well. Jesus understands what the purpose of the covenant was, the purpose of God's covenant with Abraham. As we've mentioned before, Jesus knows that the covenant with Israel was that the whole world would be blessed through Abraham's family. He says, I will make of you a great nation, and through you all the nations of the world will be blessed. He knows that this Syro-Phoenician Canaanite woman she's just claiming that blessing that God has extended through the family of Abraham. She's just saying, why not now? She's saying, why not now, Lord? I'm ready. I need it. My daughter needs it. Israel was the forerunner, that blessing carrier. In Matthew's account, verses 29 and 30, in Matthew's account, Jesus says, O woman, your faith is great. Go, your daughter has been healed. In Mark here, he just says, because of this answer, go. The demon has gone out of your daughter. That answer being, yes, Lord, but even the dogs under the table feed on the children's crumbs. And Jesus knows this woman is no dog. We shouldn't read this as the woman setting Jesus straight. She's not setting him straight or out-juking him, but rather she is persistent. She is being persistent in her request to Jesus. And it should cause us to consider our prayers and requests of God. You're not going to outsmart God, and that's not what this woman does. She doesn't outsmart Jesus, but her answer did impress him. And it pointed to her great faith in him. As Matthew says, O woman, your faith is great. That great faith that this woman had in Jesus, it moved him. Are we persistent in our requests of Jesus, our requests of the Trinity? And what's more, are we proactive in prayer? Are we proactive in, because this woman goes, she finds Jesus, she's asking, seeking, knocking. There's a lot built into this theology. Jesus encourages us to ask, seek, knock, to dialogue with him, to engage with him. It's not just we mail God a letter. Prayer is not just like mailing God a letter and saying, well, hope he gets back to me. It's conversation, it's dialogue, it's back and forth. And ultimately, this woman recognizes that Jesus has power and authority. She falls at his feet. She calls him Lord in verse 28. She says, Lord, to him. She recognizes his authority and his, she's not trying to arm wrestle Jesus to heal her daughter, but she does engage with him. And it's important to note, what is she asking for? What is she being proactive on account of? This is not about, how to pray for money or fame. This is not about pray for, oh Lord, just make me famous so that I can whatever, just make me rich. Or nope. That's not it at all. She's asking on behalf of her daughter. She's praying, engaging on behalf of someone else, not on behalf of her own benefit or her own glory or status or anything like that. This isn't even about asking for ourselves. In context, this is about the woman asking Jesus for just a little bit of what she sees him giving to her Jewish neighbors. Just a little bit, Lord. And again, not riches or anything, but she sees Jesus casting out demons and healing, and she says, I want that for my daughter too, Lord. I want that healing for my daughter too. Jesus tells us, again, in Matthew, he tells us to ask, seek, knock. How should our requests to God be proactive? This woman is very much engaged with Jesus in asking, seeking, and knocking. We'll quickly move on to the story of the man whose hearing is restored. So there's something going on here in verse 33 with Jesus' spit, and we're going to get into that more because he's going to do it again when he heals the blind man. He is going to spit on the ground and make mud and rub it in the man's eyes. Really weird. This is weirder, I think, that he takes the saliva. It says right here, the Bible, there's weird things in the Bible, but in verse 33 it says, Jesus took the man aside from the crowd by himself. He put his fingers into the man's ears, and after spitting, Jesus touched the man's tongue with the saliva. I mean, that's super gross to me, but there's something going on here. We're going to get into it more when we get into the blind man. And so, but it talks about in Isaiah 35 that this servant that God is sending, this servant that God will send, he says, "Behold, your God will come with vengeance to recompense, or the recompense of God will come, but he will save you. Then the eyes of the blind will be opened, and the ears of the deaf will be unstopped. Then the lame will leap like a deer, and the tongue of the mute will shout for joy. For waters will break forth in the wilderness, and streams in the Arabah. The scorched land will become a pool, and thirsty ground springs of water. In the haunt of jackals, its resting place, grass becomes reeds and rushes." Talking about that when God returned to Israel, and he did return in Jesus, he says, when God returns to Israel, the deaf will hear, the blind will see, the mute will shout for joy. And we have this in this story here, the deaf ears being opened. And it says his ears were opened, and the impediment of his tongue was removed, and he began speaking plainly. That's in verse 35 there of chapter 7. And then Jesus, in verse 36, once again, he says, don't tell anybody. Now he's in Gentile country, and he's saying, don't tell anybody. It's interesting, too, the deep sigh in verse 34. You notice in verse 34, it says, "And looking up to heaven with a deep sigh, Jesus said to him, Ephphatha," which is be opened. And he's going to sigh again in chapter 8. He's going to sigh again after the feeding of the 4,000. It's almost this, Jesus just acknowledges, and in the fully human part of Jesus, he acknowledges that, because he's listening to the Spirit always. I mean, fully God, he's fully in tune with God, but he acknowledges that he can't slow it down. It's accelerating. It's moving faster and faster. And he's like, I'm trying to get up here. I'm trying to rest. I'm trying to escape notice. And he's like, I'm going to do this. And I know it's just going to make this thing explode even more. I restore a man's hearing. I restore a mute man's speech. But then he tells a man, it's just really funny. He tells a man who is finally able to speak again, not to say anything. And so it's it's a little bit of a pun almost, there. There's this question of timing. He's trying to get the message out as much as he can to the lost sheep of Israel. He's trying to slow things down a little bit. It's just not working. And the Spirit keeps prompting him, and he keeps being moved with compassion again and again to intervene and to help these people and to work in their lives. He's trying to slow play. It's referred to a lot of times as the messianic secret, the secret of the Messiah. And in Mark especially talks a lot about that messianic secret that Jesus is trying to slowly reveal who he is. And the reason being is that, you had people that had been waiting for over 500 years at this point, had been in exile for over 500 years, waiting for the Messiah. And if Jesus just goes out and starts healing people and casting out demons and all that and says, I am the Messiah, they're going to expect something totally different than what they got. And that's what they get. In later in Mark chapter 8, at the Transfiguration and at Peter's confession of who the Christ is, that Jesus is the Christ. That's in verses 27 through the end of the chapter, I guess, there. Peter is going to say, you are the Messiah. You are the Christ. You are the Christ. Jesus is going to say, you're right. And then he warns him not to tell anyone. And then as soon as he says that he's going to be turned over to the chief priests and the scribes and the elders and killed and raised on the third day, Peter takes him aside to rebuke him. I mean, this is 5 verses apart, because Peter said, oh, no, you being the Christ means you're going to stomp our enemies. You're going to stomp Rome. But Jesus being the Christ means he laid his life down for his enemies, which included us too. Paul says, while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. While we were still enemies of God, Christ died for us. But yeah, so despite Jesus' best efforts, though, to slowly let out this secret of his being the Messiah, it just continues to accelerate. Don't tell anyone, as we've heard that before. Oh yes, in Jewish parts of the region, we've heard, don't tell anyone. Keep this on the down low. And then they say something interesting there in verse 37. They say, he has done all things well. They were utterly astonished, saying, he has done all things well. Jesus makes even the deaf to hear and the mute to speak. Now in Psalm 98, it's not a direct quote of that he has done all things well, but it's actually pretty close. It's interesting. Mark's going to throw you breadcrumbs to get you to dig. But in Psalm 98, it says, oh, sing to the Lord a new song, for he has done wonderful things. His right hand and his holy arm have gained the victory for him. The Lord has made known his salvation. He has revealed his righteousness in the sight of the nations. He has revealed his righteousness in the sight of the nations. He has remembered his loving kindness and his faithfulness to the house of Israel. And it says, all the ends of the earth have seen the salvation of our God. Not just Israel. He's revealed it to Israel, and that's what Jesus is doing here. He's revealing God's plan to Israel, but it says all the ends of the earth have seen the salvation of our God. He has revealed his righteousness in the sight of the nations, there in verse 2. Shout joyfully to the Lord, all the earth. Break forth and sing for joy and sing praises. Sing praises to the Lord with the lyre and the sound of melody, with trumpets and the sound of the horn. Shout joyfully before the King, the Lord. Let the sea roar and all it contains, the world and those who dwell in it. Not just Israel and those who dwell in it, the world and those who dwell in it. Let the rivers clap their hands. Let the mountains sing together for joy before the Lord, for he is coming to judge the earth. He will judge the world with righteousness and the peoples with equity. In verse 1 there, just, oh, sing to the Lord a new song, for he has done wonderful things. He does all things well. He does all things well. And then this next story, this last story that we're going to touch on today, but it intentionally frames this up really well too. Again, this is why we don't just read a verse. Jesus is going to feed everyone, and it's a lot more than just crumbs. He's going to feed 4,000 Gentiles, and it's a lot more than just crumbs. It says that they were fully satisfied. The disciples, once again, don't get it. In chapter 8, verse 4 there, the disciples answered Jesus, where will anyone be able to find enough bread here in this desolate place to satisfy these people? And literally, one chapter ago, he fed over 5,000 people in the same basic situation. I mean, almost identical situation. But if you notice, back then, here they're saying there's not enough bread. How are we ever going to find enough bread for these people? The first time, they're like, well, we don't have enough money to buy bread. They're like, we'd be willing to buy bread for them, but we don't have enough money. Here it's just, where are you going to find enough bread? And so it's just interesting. You have 12 Jewish apostles. And again, this is not about setting Jew against Gentile in the least, not in the least. But this is about the fact that Jesus now has a large crowd of Gentiles, and he's teaching his apostles. He's teaching them exactly the thing that he was talking about in chapter 7, where he's saying, it's not what goes into you that makes you clean or unclean. You're about to eat with 4,000 Gentiles. Also, you're going to serve them. And that's what happens in this story. The disciples, they don't get it, and we will get into that more next week, because this hardness of heart, as Mark has been telling us about the apostles, they don't get it. But the disciples, they don't expect Jesus to feed these people, even though it's almost an identical situation to the feeding of the 5,000. It's almost identical. And the language repeats itself and everything. And the apostles, have no expectation that Jesus would do the same thing. They're looking at this crowd of 4,000 and saying, why would we feed the dogs when the children don't even have anything to eat? Or the children have 7 loaves and you expect us to feed the dogs first? That's exactly what Jesus tells them to do. They had zero expectations of feeding those people, but not only will they sacrifice to feed this crowd of Gentiles, but they will actually serve these Gentiles as well. And Jesus is breaking down these barriers. Again, this is not about superiority. It's not about inferiority, superiority. We don't want nothing like that out of this. But again, because it's not about inferiority or superiority, it's about everyone has a place at the table of Jesus. Everyone has a place in the family of God. Jesus is breaking down that barrier in real time here. He's breaking down that barrier between Jews and Gentiles. And that same pattern, he's doing that same pattern that he does in the first story and that will carry on into the Last Supper, where he takes, in verse 6 there, chapter 8, verse 6, he directed the people to sit down on the ground, and taking the 7 loaves, he gave thanks, and he broke them, and started giving them to his disciples to serve to the people. And they served them to the people. The disciples serve 4,000 Gentiles. He blessed, broke, gave it to the disciples. And the Gentiles are welcomed at the Lord's table, Jesus' table as well. Praise God that we're welcomed in. We've been grafted in. We've been grafted into the family of God. Praise God. It's not that the Jewish branches have been ripped off so that we can be grafted in, but rather we're one family. Paul says there's neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male nor female, but Christ is all, and Christ is in all. Thinking about this in the context of the disciples just a little bit more, to this point, the hearts of the apostles have been described as hard. It says that their hearts were hardened. They didn't recognize Jesus as he walked across the water. In chapter 6, verses 45 to 52, in 6:51, it says, "Then Jesus got into the boat with them, and the wind stopped, and they were utterly astonished, for they had not gained any insight from the incident of the loaves, from the feeding of the 5,000, but their heart was hardened." And we're going to talk about that more next week, but that's how they've been described to this point. Later in this chapter, they're going to start to get it, but just barely. Still just barely. What does it mean, though, for Jesus to be the Messiah of the Jewish people? And if Jesus is the Messiah of the Jewish people, if he has come for the lost sheep of Israel, and if he is saying, my mission to this woman, if he's saying to this woman, my mission is to the children first, to the Israelites first, what does it mean then if he is leading his disciples to do this with Gentiles? It's a very different Messiah than what they expected. That's a Messiah who lays down his life. That's a Messiah who serves all. He is Jewish. Jesus was Jewish, absolutely. But he came to bring blessing to all the nations of the world, not just the Jews. What's that going to mean for his kingdom? What kind of kingdom is that going to be? Where you have Jews serving Gentiles and Gentiles serving Jews and vice versa, like where these barriers are broken down in this kingdom. The Messiah breaks down these cultural barriers between people. Because you go back to the Old Testament and it's like Jews and Canaanites are historically not friends. And Jews and Samaritans, Jesus gets at that with the parable of the Good Samaritan. Jews and Samaritans hated each other. They couldn't stand each other. You read some of the Second Temple literature, and we did a little bit several years ago now, but with that parable, they could not stand each other. Samaritans and Jews in particular couldn't stand each other because Samaritans were half Jewish and had intermarried with the Babylonians and Assyrians and all that. And so they really, friends and enemies. But they all ate and were satisfied. And again, as we said, it was more than just crumbs. It wasn't just crumbs falling off the table. It was more than enough. So in the book of Genesis, just a quick little trivia. How many nations are there in chapter 5 of Genesis? Do you kids remember? Anybody remember? So it's in Genesis chapter 5. There's 70 nations. Now Jesus feeds Jews, and there's 12 baskets left over. He feeds Gentiles, and there's 7 baskets left over. The 70 nations are what's represented there. Just it's a little nod to Jesus feeds the nations. All the nations of the world were blessed. For us, the takeaway, and we're landing the plane, the Gentiles don't make you unclean. That's what, praise God, we're Gentiles. But in the context of the story, Jesus is showing in fact, not just in word, not just sitting around with these Pharisees who are trying to debate with him over hand washing. Jesus is showing he's living out what he says to the Pharisees there earlier in chapter 7. And he's actually going to the Gentiles and saying, this isn't making me unclean. The Gentiles are not what make you unclean. They're humans just like anyone else, dearly loved by God and welcomed into the family of God. And God's plan was never for the Israelites to be the only people of God. He did call them out for a specific purpose. Absolutely. That's the Bible. He called them out for a specific purpose, and he elected them to do a job, a vocation, of course, but not so that they could rule the world and lord over everyone else. That's not the point of the Hebrew Bible, of the Old Testament, is that Israel will be the top dog and they'll be over, no pun intended with the story today, but like that Israel will be top dog and they'll be over everybody else and lord over everyone. They were called to be a blessing, that God would make Abraham's family into a great nation, and that through them all the nations of the world would be blessed. Unfortunately, you read the prophets in the time of the exile, and they just did a really bad job at it. And we're finishing up Deuteronomy as a family. Moses prophesies. He's like, you guys are not going to keep this law. You're not going to do it. He's like, I just know you're not going to, unfortunately. But that was the calling for them, was to be that light to the nations. Exactly that. And Jesus, the thing is, what's true, we've said this before, but what's true of the Messiah is true of his people. So Jesus comes and does live as the faithful Israelite. Jesus comes and does perfectly live out the Jewish vocation. But that's the beauty of what Jesus does, is Jesus does for all what only he could do ultimately. God ultimately has to keep the covenant by himself, still through humans, but through someone who is fully God and fully man. He keeps the covenant and lives as the faithful Israelite and fulfills Israel's calling, their original calling. He does keep the law perfectly. Not the hand-washing stuff that's tacked on later, but he does fulfill the law and fulfills Israel's vocation as a light to the nations. But anytime that we start to think that we are the exclusive people of God, we also can be in danger of making that same error. We may make the very same error that the disciples are making here, thinking that we're somehow above those around us, the people that we would consider the Gentiles now in our context. I won't fill in those blanks for you. I'll let your mind go wherever it goes. But who are our Gentiles? Who are the people that we view as a less than class or race or culture or whatever? It's not that hard to fill in that blank. Imagine being surrounded by 4,000 of those people, whoever that is. And hopefully it's nobody. Hopefully we love everybody equally. But imagine being surrounded by 4,000 of the people that you disagree with most from a cultural, religious, historical background perspective, and saying, I need to feed these people. I want to take care of these people. I want to show love and compassion to these people. That's what Jesus is challenging us to, even now, is to love our Gentiles. Again, I'm using that term as a placeholder, because we're Gentiles. But as we image Christ, we're called to that same work. And I hope we don't think of any people groups or cultures as dogs. But if we did, who would they be? And who would we be tempted to think, what group or culture or nation would we be tempted to think is beyond God's reach and is beyond his love and beyond his compassion? I hope the answer, as I said, is nobody. Because now anybody can be a child of Abraham through faith. Anyone can be a brother or sister through Christ. What is Jesus calling us to in relation to our Gentile neighbors? Jesus breaks down prejudices and cultural walls. Are our other neighbors drawn to Jesus by what they see in us, in our lives, our words, and our actions? Do they see Jesus? And is the gospel of the kingdom spilling over in our own lives to the point that it can't be ignored? The gospel of Jesus Christ, as we said, is too big to be contained by one tribe or tongue or nation. And in its purest form, it does draw people. People see that. They see the feast that we are partaking of, and they say, I want some of that. Even if it's just the crumbs. Even if it's just the crumbs. And the gospel says, no. You don't have to crawl down under this table. You're part of a family. Yeah, you're part of a family. God is calling you to be part of a family. Now, again, that requires submission to King Jesus. It requires being his people, but all are invited. All are invited to the table. As we ask and seek and knock, how are we engaging in prayer? I feel like those are the main two takeaways, but just how are we engaging with the Trinity in prayer and in our requests of them? And are we asking, seeking, knocking, more than just mailing a letter to God and saying, well, I hope he gets back to me, but actually engaging? And who are our Gentile neighbors? And do they see a feast when they look at us? To our lost neighbors, our lost friends or co-workers or people that we've never met before, do they see a feast when they see Christians? Do they see what Jesus is doing in our lives and say, I got to know more about that. I need to know more about that. And I'm going to ask and seek and knock until I find out more about that. Or is it kind of like, ugh, Christians, yuck. So, something to take away for us. So, anyway, let's pray, and then we'll take communion together. Father, we're thankful. We're just thankful for your great grace and love and compassion, for your great mercy. Lord, I'm so thankful as a Gentile believer who's been grafted in. I am so touched and moved by how welcome I feel in your presence, Lord. How welcome we are at your table, Lord, that you have invited us in, no matter who we are, no matter what our background is, no matter where we come from or what we've done before, Lord, you invite us to come, take, and eat, and to be part of your family if we will follow Jesus and live out his teaching and his way. Lord, I thank you for that. That's just so wonderful, and we're so thankful for that. Lord, just be with us through this day as we continue through the rest of this worship service, just as we take communion together, and we're so thankful for Jesus. It's his name we pray. Amen.